Welcome to Ceci, the podcast where you see what others see.
Hi there. Good morning. So today, what are we talking about? Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? Ceci here. Is anyone there? Hi, my name is Ceci. I'm based in Berlin, and I want to welcome you to Ceci, the podcast where you see what others see. In this season, we're talking about movement. And today, we will talk about moving into the human brain's gentle and fascinating roads.
Our guest today is German neurosurgeon Professor Peter Vajkoczy, considered one of the best neurosurgeons in the world. Since 2007, he's been the head of the Department of Neurosurgery and Pediatric Neurosurgery at Charité Universitätsmedizin in Berlin, Germany. He's responsible for leading 5,000 brain surgeries per year, 800 of which are performed by him. He studied medicine at the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität in Munich and with full scholarship by the German National Merit Foundation. He earned a PhD at the Institute for Surgical Research, University Hospital Grossharden of the University of Munich, and then completed his residency at the Department of Neurosurgery Mannheim University Hospital of the University of Heidelberg, where he specialised in neurosurgery, where he also worked as senior physician and later as assistant medical director of that same department. A full professor at the Department of Neurosurgery at Charité Universitätsmedizin and an associate professor of neurosurgery at the University of Heidelberg. He specialises in diagnostics and treatment of cerebrovascular disorders, brain tumours, skull-based tumours, and minimally invasive spine and peripheral surgery, and performs functional neurosurgery. He also performs pain management procedures. His research fields focus on brain cancer and cellular and molecular mechanisms of brain tumours, including cell migration and invasion, as well as neuronal guidance molecules for brain tumour biology. He also studies the monitoring of neocortically ill patients after vessel occlusion, including brain hemorrhage, and has special interest in homing and recruitment of immune cells to the nervous system. He's the author of numerous scientific articles as well as Kopfarbeit, a non-fiction book that provides the reader with unusual insights on brain surgery and neuroscience. Among the many honours he has received, the Young Neurosurgeon Research Award from the World Federation of Neurosurgical Societies, the Hermann Rhein Award from the German Society for Microcirculation and Vascular Biology, for great achievements in experimental and clinical research in microcirculation and vascular biology, and the Research Award from the German Academy of Neurosurgery.
Welcome, Professor Vajkoczy. An honor to have you here today.
Hello, Cecilia. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to contribute and to interact in the context of this podcast. Very excited.
Professor Vajkoczy, you perform an average of 800 surgeries per year. Each of these operations, a universe, a constellation of neurons, glial cells, neural stem cells, and blood vessels, but also of dreams, recollections, hopes, and emotions. Each of these brains, these universes, have a pace and its own rhythm, confirming the uniqueness of its individual footprint. This is sacred. You need to be quite in shape, both physically and mentally, to perform these operations. You need to be knowledgeable, disciplined, and talented. But most of all, you need undoubtedly a lot of courage. What is it that you need to be a good neurosurgeon?
I think that's a really tough question, and I've been struggling with this question the last years or even decades, and especially since I'm giving these kind of podcasts and I'm asked that repeatedly. So I thought initially it's mainly about talent, the talent of your manual dexterity, the ability to be very precise and with your hands without shaking. But meanwhile, I think that this is maybe only 30% or so, which really contributes to the success of a neurosurgeon. I recently read a book about outliers, and it's exactly about this, that we all think that the talent is the main driving factor, which basically means that somebody who has not the talent would not be able to do it. But the book also comes to the conclusion that those that make it, those that are really outliers, they have some talent, of course, but it takes more and other circumstances. So I think let's stay with the talent. I think talent is still important, but it's not really the talent of your hands. It's more the talent to really be disciplined, to go the extra mile, to work hard, because you all know that to play a piano or an instrument or to dance or to do neurosurgery, it takes a lot of hours to practice. And the rule of thumb is 10,000 hours to learn something in a way that you are really perfect or very good with it. So I think you need, number one, talent that you just don't feel that it's a hurt or a pain if you work hard, but you enjoy improving. Number two, I think you should also have classical values. Classical values like discipline, as I said, like courage, what you mentioned, but also humility, accepting that you are prone to fail, being not arrogant. And I think if you have these classical values, you are in pretty good shape of becoming a good surgeon in general and a neurosurgeon in particular. And we now recognize that these are all things that you have to bring into your training, and you have to acquire these things many years before you think about becoming a neurosurgeon. So it's really a fundament or the basis of what we are doing. And I think then you also, as you mentioned, have to be in good shape physically and psychologically. But these are things I believe that you can learn while you are on the training, and it's part of the training.
In your book, Kopfarbeit, in English would be brain work, right?
Right.
Which I hope will be published in English soon, by the way, because it's a super read. Well, in your book, you use a beautiful allegory when you compare the precision needed in a microsurgery with that of a professional dancer. We will hear now a translation of an excerpt of your book that I hope makes justice to your excellently written work.
Perhaps one can compare the work of neurosurgery with that of dancers, because here too several elements come together. Dancers not only have to be physically fit and need to know the complete choreography by heart, but they also need to practice each of the jumps and figures again and again by themselves and in interplay with the music and their partners on stage. Dancers need to work with absolute precision, and they need to be able to trust each other while also paying attention to the music and the orchestra. As surgeons, dancers are also driven by the desire for perfection, the unconditional love for their art, and the feeling of responsibility to bring their personal talent to its fullest development, to make people happy. All this needs a never-fading energy to practice for hours, every day, and never be pleased as long as it's not perfect. And it never is.
You talk a lot about dancing. Do you actually like dancing?
I like dancing, but in a freestyle way, not in a disciplined way. But I learned this allegory, or I was inspired by my coworker and colleague, Professor Winkler, Peter Winkler. His daughter is a professional dancer in London. And while we were discussing what it needs to be a neurosurgeon, I was discussing with him my ideas about musicians, about an orchestra. And in the end, we ended up with the allegory of the dancer. And that was because his daughter is a professional dancer in London.
As you were depicturing surgery as an artistic choreography, I picture you as if you were doing the finest of the qigongs, really as you would be dancing with your hands very subtly. Now we will hear another clip from a previous interview in the season Movement from Elisa Carrillo Cabrera, first dancer of the Stadtballett Berlin, where she talks about moments where she feels so in tune as if her muscles would seem to know what to do next without having to think about it, as if they would have a memory of their own.
I think there is also this inner way of your body reacting to the movements. And what I find amazing, it's sometimes you dance something and a couple of years you don't perform it. And the day you have to do it again, sometimes you don't, if you try to think of the movement, it doesn't come to your mind. But as soon as the music plays, your body remembers.
Would this also be the case for you? Are there moments where everything is in such a flow that your hands and fingers are so attuned with your brain, perhaps also your soul, that they know exactly where to go and what to address?
Exactly. I think there are many parallels between this description and the description of the flow during a neurosurgical procedure. I think this is really what motivates every neurosurgical expert doing that profession, maybe reaching that kind of state or that state of the flow. The first time point when I came across the flow concept was when I was discussing with my friend David Langer from New York, from Lenox Hill. You might know him through the Netflix series. And he pointed out to me that book by this Hungarian philosopher who was talking about or was writing about flow. And I learned that it's about learning, how you learn things. I mean, if you start as a beginner, you have no idea what you don't know. Then you realize that there are many things where you're not competent yet. Then in the next stage of learning, you are aware that you are becoming confident and competent in the different details, but you still have to think about the right movements and how to master the things. But if you are really close to perfection, and obviously you'll never be super perfect, but you are close to perfection, then you reach a state where you are suddenly functioning and you are doing the things from your hands, from your mind, and things suddenly happen without being consciousness or aware of it. So it's really automatic. And then things flow out of the body. You do the operation, and time is becoming a relevant issue. You are not nervous anymore. You're not afraid. And things just move along perfectly. And this is really what we understand in surgery when we talk about flow. And this is really the perfect situation. What we are aiming for, and I hope that every surgeon reaches that state on a regular basis, because this gives also the best results.
So you also operate patients that are awake during surgery. For a surgery of an awakened patient, you narrate in your book that there are up to 15 people in the operation room. This high-performance team must work hand in hand with great concentration through the operation, also together with the patient that, of course, is awake. If you would allow me now, I would try to depict for the audience, because this is science fiction. It is really like a NASA's launching of a spaceship. I would try to describe what I read in your book. So, in the operation room, there's the surgeon, then a computational neuroscientist, and another neurosurgeon specialized in digitalization and artificial intelligence, who in advance visualize a map of the brain functions by using algorithms to make risk assessments to later propose specific surgical strategies. And then there's also an anesthesiologist that needs to wake up the patient after being under anesthesia, of course, because the opening of the skull is very painful. And electrophysiologists who monitors the brain's important functions and cranial nerves. Linguists to perform all different evaluations of speech. Neuropsychologists for the assessment of the neurocognitive abilities, like memory, the ability to plan emotionally, and so on. The trained nurses, of course, a new radiologist for imaging in the operating room, and sometimes there's also neurologist for surgical epilepsy diagnostics. So, we will now hear a clip of a previous interview to Jose Hernandez, former NASA astronaut, on the team building experience they go before going to space.
It was a great experience. We did several team building experiences that basically, I would say, put us in extreme conditions as a team. We did water survival training. We did winter survival training, cold weather training. We did wilderness survival training where we're in the middle of nowhere, no food, no water. We had to trap our own food and water and get to a pickup point. And then we did the Baja trip. And I think this allowed us to get comfortable with each other, all seven of us, where we can finish each other's sentences, where we learn the strengths and the weaknesses of each other, and we were able to support each other so that the whole team was successful.
In your case, how do you create a synergy with your coworkers that will allow you to trust and support each other and operate in the best way possible?
A good question, because I really like to refer to the team during the Awake Craniotomy as a high-performance team. And I gave presentations in the past where I was really addressing how to select the team, how to motivate the team, and I used that as a use case, maybe for others to build their teams. And when I dug into this topic, I learned about the Alinghi, not so much about the NASA, so it was really interesting to hear what they did. But I learned about the Alinghi, where really from scratch, from nothing, they built like a team for a sailing boat, and they won the race, the cup. And I think number one, it starts with the selection of the people. They have to be highly motivated and experts in their fields, and to also comment on the team. We also have scientists there that use the awake patient as a possibility to learn more about the brain, and they also give their input into the whole procedure. So it's really another team player that is really part of it. Then I think it's very important to have a common aim and a mission, which is sometimes difficult if you are working like in business areas where it's really hard to define what's the mission, or where you don't really have a common goal, which is beyond selling something. But in the OR, when we are treating the patient, obviously everybody's highly motivated of helping the patient, bringing the patient through the surgery. And I think I don't really have to work much on that, because everybody understands that they are doing something very specifically and very unique there. And then it needs a commitment of everybody. And this is part of the training. This is part of how they are motivated and how they see the mission. The commitment is really to reach the surgical procedure at the highest level. And in addition to all these things, we obviously also do some team building experiences. But we are obviously not going to the moon or not to the desert, or don't have to hunt our own food. But we go like skiing and mountaineering and experience the nature together, or celebrate simply together. I think these are already very precious team building experiences, and I think that as a whole really helps to create this really unique team that we have in our OR at the Charité.
One of the best lines of your book is where you mention how these teams have different rituals before beginning a surgery. You mention how in the US it is often that the team comes together in a hug, as it is shown in the show that you were mentioning before, the TV documentary series Lenox Hill. And then you reference your team's own ritual, and you described in your book,
Once more, we all make eye contact, and then I ask, is everybody ready? And the team answers, all ready. We attune, and the operation begins.
I have to tell you, I was incredibly moved. I have to pause to continue reading. What has been the most moving experience you have had while working with this high-performance team?
The most moving experience depends on what is really moving us. I mean, it's moving if we help patients in extreme situations, and you usually do the awake craniotomy in order to save the language or the other neurocognitive performances or possibilities of the patient. And if that really happens, for example, we had a young kid with a brain tumor that was speaking 3 different languages, and we succeeded of taking out the tumor and saving all the 3 languages, which is not self-understood because the 3 languages are really coded in different areas of the brain, close to each other, but still it was really a huge success to bring that young kid through the operation. We were also moved in a situation that is described in the book, where we had a young patient that suddenly started to watch his own operation on the monitor and was curious to see how I operated on the brain while this person was talking to me, which was in a way a unique experience for everybody, but again, very moving. So it really depends on your expectations, but awake craniotomies are always a source for inspiration and for experiencing unique team moments.
These operations take at least 4 to 6 hours, the longest having been 13 hours, I believe. And apart from being long, they're extremely complex and complicated. Besides, everything happens in the micro range of what you can see through a microscope magnified up to 40 to 45 times. And you sew with threads that are only a few hundredths of millimeter in a diameter. A micro movement in your hand in the wrong direction could mean someone could not speak, move, or breathe again. In your book, Kopfarbeit, brain work, you talk about stress and about the decision-making in assessing risks and extending somebody's life or granting him or her quality time. You're all very open about the difficult moments you have to undergo when talking to the patient, when visiting him or her after surgery to see if he or she will speak again, and also how before entering surgery, on your way to the hospital, driving your car, you go in your head over and over each step of the operation, as if you were rehearsing a choreography. You even describe once dreaming of an ocean of blood in which you felt you could drown. Because you can be one of the best neurosurgeons in the world, but at the end you're also human. And how you were talking about humility, right? You come from a culture that by nature is a perfectionist culture, for good or bad. How has been the process that has taught you to cope with mistakes, and how have you evolved to be able to accept imperfection as part of your human condition?
I mean, coping with mistakes is something that you don't learn in the university. You're never taught how to do it. You learn the science, you learn the biology, the physiology, the pathology, but you never learned how to cope with difficult situations. And when you decide to enter training for something like neurosurgery, you only see the challenge and the beautiful anatomy, but most of our beginners, young residents, they don't even have an idea about the psychological stress they will experience when they fail for the first time. And so it comes without saying, and it comes without a wonder, that initially this process of learning how to cope with disappointments can be very rough. Initially, you think that you are super, then you have your first failures, you are depressed, and you start to oscillate between feeling the greatest and suddenly feeling like a small light or a small sausage, basically. And this is part of the training, that you plateau somewhere and you stop oscillating. You accept that you have mistakes and failures. And I really want to stress that the book, and this was really important to me, is about successes, but it's also about very severe disappointments for both the patients and the surgeons. So it's really to show the whole variety of psychological moments. And so if you plateau and you understand that you shouldn't be arrogant about your successes because the disappointments are just around the next corner, you've already developed one very good strategy. This is your own expectation management. And the number two is that you have to accept that you will mistakes, and I'm still working on that. As you said, one of my drivers is perfectionism, and this is not always good, because every time you succeed, you raise the bar, and things that that you accepted as mistakes maybe in the past are now really hurting you, because you really want to avoid these minor mistakes. And so it will always be a fight. And this is, I think, another important aspect, because patients like to think that with the increasing age and increasing experience, sometimes you get you get resistant to that kind of emotions, but which is not true, because we always feel with our patients, we feel bad. But we have that empathy with our patients, so we suffer with every patient where we fail. And so it's really important to come to peace, to find a peaceful state of mind. But reaching that peaceful state of mind is not a peaceful way. It's really fighting with yourself. You are in war with yourself. You are disappointed. You are disappointed that you hurt the patient. You are disappointed with yourself. Obviously, also your narcissistic side of the surgeon is hurt, because why did it happen to me? This kind of complication. So you really are in a war with yourself, and you have to find a way out of this and reach the state of peace. And I learned that talking is a very good way. I talk to myself, I analyze, I talk to my family, my wife, and I like to talk to the team and make them understand and get their input on my mistakes. And I also like to create a philosophy or a concept where everybody should not fear to speak out and describe what they feel and describe their complications, so that we learn. And I think complications are acceptable as long as we learn from these complications, as long as we understand where we failed, in order to avoid these kind of complications in the future for the next generation of patients that is coming along.
The human brain is, according to you, a beautiful aesthetic organ, capable of the most amazing things. It is a miracle in its own nature. And among the amazing plasticity and the things that the brain can do is the ability to do abstractions, abstract concepts that later will find its place in the brain in the form of memories. You were speaking about this boy and the 3 languages that occupy a different area, even if they're close to each other in the brain. So we will now hear a clip of Professor Alfonso Caramasa, Daniel and Amy Starch Professor of Psychology and Director of the Cognitive Neuropsychology Laboratory at Harvard University, where he talks about a study he conducted in this regard, specifically to prove how the experience of color, even if it has not gone through the senses, in this case sight, as it is the case of the blind, it can nevertheless be located in the brain in the area where concepts are usually located.
There's one project that we published in Neuron, I think a year or two ago, with my collaborator in Beijing. Yan Xiaobi was a former student of mine at Harvard, but now is a senior professor at Harvard in China, and Xiaoying Wang. We studied, again, color in blind individuals, a much more detailed study. And what we found there in the study is that the activation of color in these abstract areas in the blind is also found in the sighted. When a sighted person understands the color red or sees the perception red, they also activate the same area that we find in the blind. So you sighted individuals, you have the sensory experience of color, but you also have the abstract knowledge of color, its relation to other things, like we were saying, to roses and so on. And that knowledge seems to be represented in these anterior areas of the temporal lobe. The difference between the two groups is that whereas in the blind, that activation is not connected to sensory areas, we found that in the sighted, this area, this abstract color area, is directly connected with visual areas in the perception system. So the blind have activation of color, but it's not something miraculous and strange and different. It's exactly what we have. What is missing for them is the connection of that experience, that knowledge, to the sensory experience of color. So in a way, we are starting to understand the relationship between the sensory information and the more abstract information.
So, Professor Vajkoczy, apart from these abstractions, there are also emotions and other realities such as an instinct, intuition, and personality. Where does these other dimensions of emotions, thoughts, and impressions are physically located in the brain, meaning they could be altered due to a damage by brain stroke, an injury caused in an accident, or from a negative outcome after surgery?
See, the problem with the brain is that we don't really understand too much about the brain. I mean, our knowledge about the location of complex cognitive functions is really limited. We understand where the motor is, the ability to move our hands and arms. We understand a little bit, or we have some idea about how language is working, but recently it has become clear that it's even more complex than we thought with all these connections. Your former guest has taught us where color is coded in the brain, or the perception of color. It's in the temporal lobe. But really, many of these cognitive functions we cannot really locate. And there are traditional ways to understand where they might be. This is usually by damaging. If you have a stroke, or if you have performed surgery, or if you have a tumor in this area, then usually you lose the function, and indirectly you can draw conclusions about the pattern of the stroke, that maybe the function is located within this area. But there's a caveat about it, because today we have the concept of the connectome. We understand that all these areas where we thought that they are isolated, I mean, that was a little bit naive to think that they are isolated, but it has become apparent that they are all connected with all these different tracts, and which we call the connections, or the science about these connections is called the connectome. All these connections as a whole, the connectome, referencing what you know from molecular biology about the proteomics or the transcriptome. So this has shown us that it's even more complex than we thought before, and I wouldn't dare really to say where and how higher cognitive functions are located, how they are connected to each other. And then the next question is, how redundant are they? Are there areas that you can hurt, or that they can be impaired without losing the function? Or are there really critical key areas? If they are destroyed, or if they are impaired, then this function is gone.
Hi, we would love to hear your comments and learn about what you see. Share your input at www.ccpodcast.com and follow us on social media. Oh, I almost forgot. To accompany us in this season's journey, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. And now let's continue with Ceci.
As a scientist, you're certainly well interested in the interaction of different medicine branches. So we know from different studies that the brain and the gastrointestinal system are intimately connected to the brain, to the extreme that the enteric nervous system that regulates our gut is often referred as a second brain. The second brain contains some 100 million neurons, more than either the spinal cord or the peripheral nervous system. It also uses more than 30 neurotransmitters, just like the brain. And in fact, 90% of the body's serotonin is found in the bowels. So the exchange between these two large nerve centers is massive. And evidence shows microbiome as possible key susceptibility factor for mental health problems such as anxiety and depression, and of neurological disorders like Alzheimer's disease, autism spectrum disorder, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, and stroke. This is an extremely new field, And also the microbiome being extremely variant and influenced by so many factors such as diet and exercise might perhaps make my next question sound extremely subjective. Nevertheless, I would like to ask you, from your perspective as a neurosurgeon and in terms of an interdisciplinary exchange, is there something you could share with us about the studies of the gut microbiome and its connection with your field?
Yeah, it's really a fascinating field that you're mentioning there in the field of neuroscience and neuroimmunology. And I should point out that this is not really down to my expertise. But I think there are two ways to look at it. Number one, as you mentioned, you have two nervous systems, the central nervous system in the brain and the peripheral vegetative nervous system in the gut. And there's certainly a crosstalk. And which really highlights this crosstalk, for example, is when you have an epileptic seizure, so you have an epileptic fit in the brain. This, you might experience that epileptic seizure as strange feelings in your gut or as a misfunction of your gut. This shows us that there is a way of crosstalking between these two brains or nervous systems. Number two is obviously the immunological way to look at it. The microbiome has been shown to really prime our immune system. And on the other hand, in the brain has its own immune system, and they are separated by the blood-brain barrier. So there's not really a high level of trafficking in the normal, regular brain between the peripheral immune system and the brain immune system. Nevertheless, what happens in the gut and is priming the immune system seems to be highly relevant for what's going on in the brain. And this brings me to all these pathological conditions that you have mentioned that in the end are states of immune failures, either the immune surveillance or there's some autoaggression of the immune system or the clearance system of the brain is not working as in Alzheimer. So it's a failure of the immune system, and this is then obviously related to the peripheral immune system. And again, this is then part of the gut. So I think the points that you are raising are really important for the future research.
Talking about the future and interdisciplinary exchange, there is an incredible project I've heard of called the Brain Tower, as part of Charité's development on neuroscience and neurosurgery regarding technology, diagnostic, treatment, and work with interdisciplinary teams. Could you share a bit about this fascinating project?
I think it's important to understand that over the past 1 or 2 decades, Charité has really, or the neuro scene in Charité has really developed to a excellent center for neurosciences. We have many neuroscientists in the theoretical arena, in the practical arena, in the clinical settings, and they all work together, and it's a big bunch of excellent scientists publishing well, recruiting a lot of grant money, and really helping a lot of patients. So this is really a unique thing about Charité, and I think everybody who works at the Charité is aware of it and is proud of it, of the neuro scene, neuro field. And therefore, it's just logical. With all these developments that are ahead of us in the neuroscience and in the clinical neuro field, to bring all these people together and to really tear down the borders between the different disciplines. In the end, these are all people or scientists or clinicians that really work in the field of neuro and want to help their patients. And if you could bring them together in one big real estate, it's just logical to think of like a tall building, maybe even with the looking like a spine or looking like a brain, and you could call it the brain tower or the neuro tower. And really, the vision that we have is a fully digitalized new building where all those that are taking care of the patients with neuro diseases, operating in many different surgical environments, bringing in the latest breakthroughs, maybe having even some startups that are interested in neurodevelopments or that are working on artificial intelligence. Then we have all these things that are ahead of us with all these neuroplastics, with all these brain-machine interfaces. So just by naming all these different developments that we will experience in the next 5 to 10 years, in my eyes, if I close my eyes, I'm dreaming of a building that is a brain tower, brings all these people together, and we are not discussing anymore, are you a neurosurgeon, are you a neurologist, are you an interventionalist, are you a scientist? No, in the end, we are a big family. Highly qualified members of this family are working for these patients and are moving the field ahead and will take a lead position in the neuro field in Berlin at the Charité for whole Europe and the world.
This sounds so avant-garde. Could we expect also in the brain tower, I mean, you were talking about all of this interdisciplinary research and communication among the different disciplines. Could we also expect studies like the good microbiome that we were talking about to be integrated, or endocrinologist section, immune section, perhaps also a neurocognitive lab where movement, dance, or art therapy be provided?
Absolutely. I think this is the perfect place that this happens, because due to the size of the Charité, the large size of the Charité, we have all these disciplines here, immunologists, gastroenterologists, you mentioned endocrinologists. They are close collaborators if it comes to the pituitary and surgeries around the pituitary gland. You mentioned even artists. There is a society where we were involved, which is called neuroaesthetics. It's the neuroscience behind the perception of art, and artists are interested in how this works, obviously, because it makes them understand how the brain works if somebody looks at their artwork. So if there is a place where this happens, this should be definitely Berlin, and this is in our minds. And what we have really not yet mentioned is the public. I think the brain tower could also be a perfect place to educate the public. Similarly to the book, where I'm trying to educate lay people about what's going on in our field, the field that fascinates me, but also what the perspectives and possibilities are in the future. And I think a brain tower should also have a public arena, should also provide a public arena, a teaching and learning experience for the regular public and the regular lay people that are interested in the brain.
This is fascinating. And let us talk about where are we standing now and where are we moving in terms of innovation in neurosurgery area. The medical technical innovations over the last decade have made operations in highly sensitive regions of the brain much safer. How far computer assistance and robotics have become incorporated into clinical neurosurgery?
I mean, neurosurgically, I'm just returning from the annual Congress of German surgical disciplines, so where all the surgical disciplines gathered together, and we had a joint session about digitalization, robotics, and artificial intelligence in the OR, and it was again confirmed that neurosurgery is really the surgical discipline that is most ahead in this area of digitalization. This comes by nature because we have all this input from the imaging, we have all these connectomics that I've mentioned. Artificial intelligence is used for support systems and for risk stratifications. So I think already today we have computer assistants in the OR, we have the navigation, we have the augmented reality. So all this is already reality. But I think in the future we'll see much more of this. We'll have the robotics being in the OR and not operating by themselves, but helping the surgeons, assisting the surgeons. We will be able to bring down the information from the imaging on a voxel level and really perform non-invasive or at least micro-invasive voxel-based surgery for tumors, for example. And we'll have new areas in the ORs where we'll see brain-machine interfaces, the implantation of micro-robots into the brain to reach areas which are maybe hidden for the classical ways. We'll see the assistance of new novel imaging technologies to better understand how we can reach our targets. The treatment of dementia, movement disorders, and spinal cord injury, for example, will become very realistic in the future.
Like talking about interfaces, brain-machine interfaces and implantation from digital prostheses, right?
Exactly.
Well, now we received a question for you, Professor, which will be now played and to which we hopefully receive an encouraging answer.
Hi, my name is Juan Carlos Viñolo. I live in San Diego, California. I am 52 years old. And 9 years ago, I had an accident while riding my bicycle. A car hit us head on, and I was instantly paralyzed from my chest down with a T4 complete injury. My question for the doctor is if he thinks that someday, hopefully in the near future, maybe the next 50 years, there could be a cure or if science could manage to connect the spinal cord completely, and if so, what extension of function does he believe could be achieved?
I think here we're talking about spinal cord injury, and spinal cord injury, like stroke, are the states of the central nervous system that so far, if there has been injury, we had to accept that nothing could be done. And this left our patients in a miserable state. For spinal cord injury, I think there are some strategies ahead of us that might work. I mean, I'm very pessimistic that it will be possible to make the spinal cord reunion or to bring the ends together or to implant cells that will regenerate the spinal cord. I think this is not something that I will experience during my professional life. But what is already starting to become realistic is to use computers or electrodes in order to stimulate the spinal cord and to regain some kind of function that will help patients to do a few steps, to walk independently. They will not walk normally like they did before the injury, but it will make a huge difference for these patients if they can walk with a cane or with a stick, or if they are able to leave their apartment. And there's a group in Lausanne in Switzerland that is very successful in introducing novel strategies and algorithms or paradigms how to stimulate the spinal cord with electrodes. We have all the other exoskeletons or strategies to replace the control of the spinal cord over the muscle by alternative techniques. So I think it's realistic to say that we will experience novel technologies in 5 or 10 years that will be available on a broader scale, that will regain or reestablish part of the functions that these patients have lost.
I think people in that situation would give everything to make some steps with a cane.
And this is why we have to really be sensitive and open and should not misuse their wishes and desires to see some improvement there.
Very well said. In terms of brain tumors and bypasses, what advances could you say are the most significant?
You mean the advances that I expect to happen?
Yeah.
I think in the vascular field, we already have seen many advances, and this is obviously moving from open surgery to techniques that allow to repair blood vessels and prevent stroke by minimally invasive catheter-based techniques. I still strongly believe that surgery has a place today, but I think it would be naive to think that maybe in 10 or 20 years there will be no even more alternative techniques to help these patients. In the field of brain tumors, I already mentioned that I foresee an OR setting where we will perform voxel-based surgeries by some kind of MR-based laser technologies, which will make it not needed anymore to open the skull. We might reach these tumors by alternative ways. We will have a better imaging. We will have a better understanding of the function. We talked about the cognitive functions of the brain that by then we understand better than we do today. And then we have all these robotic systems around us, and this all will lead to a less risky and more efficient removal of brain tumors. And I strongly believe that this will still be the way to go initially, and then we will see additional therapeutic strategies like gene therapy, cell therapy, or other biological treatments that will help us to better control the regrowth of tumors, and maybe we will also experience that we can cure some of these patients in the future.
Professor Vajkockzy, you were talking about educating the public in this field. I'm talking about preventive medicine. Is it possible to prevent brain strokes? And if yes, how? And what would be the typical symptoms of a stroke, and which symptoms could also be identified as psychosomatic?
I think preventive medicine is the way to go, and this is certainly one of the novel research focus areas of our institution, Charité, here in Berlin. So there is a large intellectual and academic interest in this field, and I think the cardiologists are well ahead of everybody, as frequently, because here we understand the risk profile. What makes a patient becoming a high risk patient of developing occlusive disease of the heart vessels and making these patients prone to stroke of the heart. And similarly, we will soon better understand the genetic risk profile of a patient that is prone to have a stroke. And obviously, if you want to preventive, you have to identify these high-risk patients. You have to find ways by gene therapy to get rid of these genetic risk factors or to compensate for these risk factors. And then you might be able to prevent further strokes. And how does it feel to have a stroke? What are the symptoms? Obviously, if you are not able to speak, or if you're not able to move a hand or to move your leg, these are very stroke-like symptoms. If you are maybe losing the ability to see on one eye, this would be another classical stroke-like symptom, and this is obviously an emergency. You shouldn't lose time. Time is brain. The longer you wait, the less likely it is to regain the function, to recanalize the blood vessel and to re-establish the blood flow. So everybody should understand the symptoms, and only if in doubt, you should always think first that it's a stroke, and then if it turns out to be something else, you're the lucky guy.
So let's now move to the last phase of our interview. We will talk about movement in the sense of what moves you intellectually and spiritually. Talking about another passion of yours, which is research. You're very into the restoring of functional integrity of microvasculature to prevent neural loss and to promote neural repair. That is, if I understood well, rebuilding of vessels and neurons, right? Is that it?
Yeah, that's the super goal, to understand how neurons and blood vessels interact, to see how they build, how they regenerate, what you usually see while an embryo develops, and to understand why this is limited in the adult brain.
And you also like a lot, I've heard, evolutionary biologists' experiments. Cosmologists and physicist Jude Currivan narrates in her book, The Breath of Gaia, about an experiment with a slime mold. We will hear what this experiment was about and where the resulting process was applied.
For this experiment, researchers specifically used a plasmodial slime mold called Cephalid polycephalic polycephalum, which is a huge single cell with many different nuclei within it. Biologists put the slime mold in the middle of a plate and placed oat flakes around it. The oat flakes were not placed randomly, but rather each of them represented subway stations. The slime moves very intelligently. With its little tendrils, the mold brings its membrane out and absorbs the oat flakes without breaking the membrane of its single cell. After just a couple of hours, these single-celled beings were able to show the most effective routes between all the stations, which, by the way, were Tokyo's subway stations. When they overlaid this process of the molds, they realized it was not just the most effective way of connecting the stations, but it actually replicated the work that Japanese engineers did over a long period of time with the help of supercomputers, the exact same patterns, except, of course, being inexpensive and faster.
Thinking about how you describe the roots in the brain and how complex the brain is, would some of the resulting processes of this kind of experiments be traduced in mechanisms that could help repair the brain?
That's a very good question. This is why I like my scientific work. I think it gives me a lot of inspiration, but it also teaches me a lot about developmental biology. In our research, we frequently discuss and collaborate with developmental biologists. They look at embryos, and sometimes they look at organs or species that are less complex than the human situation. For example, zebrafish is another good example. Zebrafish, if you injure the spinal cord, if you transect it, it can fully regenerate, and the function comes back, which obviously does not work in the human situation, as we have heard. So that means if you could understand how the zebrafish works or the slime mold, then you can translate what you have learned to the human situation. And you can understand what prevents the human to regenerate in the same way as the zebrafish or the slime mold. On the other hand, this also teaches us how much more complex the human situation is. And it's one thing is to understand it, but from understanding to creating a solution to the problem and providing a therapeutic approach, this will take many decades, I assume. But it's very interesting, and it's a fascinating research field.
I love watching in the sky the dance produced by a flock of birds returning home after a long day. Homing, is the ability of some animals to find their way back home. In medicine, homing would be the phenomena whereby cells migrate to the organ of their origin, right?
By the origin, or it's also cells that spread from a primary tumor and seed as metastases. That's also homing.
Okay, so that's the bad part. In neuroscience, would it, in the good part, refer to the traveling of the engrafting of transplanted new blood cells into the bone marrow?
It would mean that cells from the bone marrow progenitor. That was one concept that many researchers worked on. That was the regeneration of any sort of tissue, like the brain or whatever, with progenitor cells, very primitive cells that make their way from the bone marrow to the target, as they might have done initially while the organism had developed. So we come to the good part of the homing. Cells travel the same way as they did before. But the problem is that with any injury, you have a scar, and the scaffold is destroyed by the scar and by the injury, which makes it difficult. Homing is one, but engraftment is the other that you need. So the cells also have to engraft and interact in the functional network. And this is, in more complex organisms, impaired by things like scarring and inflammation.
Mm-hmm. And because I know that this is one area of research that strongly moves you, homing, right? Homing. And what kind of research do you perform here, and what do you aim with it?
So homing, we look at homing in two different ways. Homing number one is the homing of metastases, of metastatic cells from a tumor, when they home to the target tissue in order to create metastases. And obviously that's the earliest step for a metastasis to form. And if we could understand or prevent that kind of homing, we could prevent the formation of metastases and help patients to overcome the tumors. Another way of how we look at the concept of homing are immune cells. If you want to treat a tumor, or if you want to fight a disease or an infection, Inflammatory cells have to get out of the blood vessels into the tissue, and this is also the homing. And the homing is always that the cells have to be arrested. They have to adhere to the vessel wall. Then they have to crawl through the vessel wall and get into the tissue. And this homing is therefore a multi-step process. And to understand these different steps at the different situations, that is a part of the research that fascinates us.
Incredible. Besides research, what drives Peter Vajkockzy to become a better surgeon day by day? And what is stronger than all of this stress that I had stress just from hearing you? I mean, I was amazed about all of these future projects and everything, but as I've said, you have to be extremely strong in different areas to do this in a day-by-day basis. What is stronger than having to overcome traumatic experiences more often than other people might have to? What is it that keeps you moving?
What keeps me moving is that I love the work. I love the challenge. I love the positive results. I mean, if I go to work and come home at night and I made the experience that I've helped patients by operating on them, it's very gratifying. And this is really like it's really like a legal drug. It makes you high, but it can also bring you down, obviously. So this is number two. I'm convinced that this is a job. Either you do it right and meet the expectations, or you shouldn't do it at all. There's no way to do it a little bit mediocre or go half the mile. As long as I am ambitious and I have my goals, I would go full speed. And there's no way to reduce it. And this is also a message maybe to the young ones that you cannot be successful in this job by going only half mile.
I will say in any job, if you want to do it right, if you want to really commit, if you want to have passion and live intensively and connect with other human beings, you cannot go halfways.
But the good thing is if you have passion about it, it doesn't hurt. Mm-hmm. So this is what I tell my residents. They should really ask themselves whether they can make that training as a priority, because it can be so intense that if you have to push yourself, if you don't have the passion, it is too painful and it's really difficult to stand it for many years. So the passion should drive you, and the passion helps you that you're doing it for. That it's not only not fun, but you enjoy doing it, and from there you get the momentum of doing it without feeling pain.
And goes beyond yourself, right?
Not all the time, not chronically, but the ability of having the ability to pass that point if it's needed is something that is very valuable.
And to help others, I think that makes the big difference.
Help others and also help yourself by being successful and reaching your goals.
Yeah, there is this story that the late Joseph Campbell, who was an expert on comparative mythology and religion, mentioned during an interview. And actually, yeah, I remember it was a real story that was reported by the newspapers in Hawaii about an heroic action by a police officer. So in Hawaii, there is this scenic an historic point uphill named Pali, which means cliff. And people go there to enjoy the wonderful views, but sadly also to commit suicide. And so there was this time where a young man wanted to end his life by jumping off the cliff. And he would, hadn't this police officer not pulled him and grabbed him, who, by the way, would also have been fallen, hadn't another police officer grabbed him and then stopped him from falling. So, well, later, I think a couple of days after this happened, a reporter asked the police officer, how was it that he risked his life and put it into the very end of the line? And I remember Joseph Campbell citing this police officer by saying that this police officer answered, he said, and I remember this word, I couldn't let go if I had let that young man go, he said, I could not have lived another day of my life. And then Joseph Campbell poses the question, and how could this police officer for this moment let everything in his life be dropped? His work, his family, his dream, everything for a stranger? Because that even goes against the self-preservation instinct. And then to answer this question, he cited Schopenhauer. And he said that there is this metaphysical realization that the self and the other are one, and that the separateness is only an effect of temporal forms. So we become in tune with time and space to the extent that we are all able to realize that in true reality, what exists is this unity with all life. And this is what puts us in contact with the experience of being alive. And I think if you help somebody, you help yourself, as you just mentioned it.
Yes, I mean, comes without saying that primary aim is to help the patients, but obviously we're doing something that we like, that we enjoy, that we find fascinating, so we are also doing it for ourselves.
Professor, who would be 3 persons? I think there's much more because you're always in connection with a lot of people that would move you to become a better surgeon, but also a better human being every day.
That moved me in the past?
Or every day? Or in
My parents, number one, and how I remember them. Number 2, my mentor, Professor Schmiedek, who was my teacher when I was in Mannheim. And all these giants of neurosurgery where I've traveled to and watched them, like, for example, Robert Spatzler, who was in Phoenix and became a close friend. I mentioned him in the book, in the introduction, and I was really inspired about the way he handled the profession and the patients. So I think mainly people in the past that really drive me and help me going.
Last question. You talk about extraordinary cases and your everyday life in the operating room in your incredible nonfiction book, Brainwork, which we have been talking about. Do you believe in miracles, Professor? And better said, have you ever experienced a miracle while operating?
Do I believe in miracles? I believe that sometimes things happen that are hard to explain, and I accept, and even as a scientist, I accept that I don't have to, and I will not be able to understand everything that is happening to me. A few things in my life has happened that fall into this category, but I wouldn't go into much detail with them, because I think if something like this happens to you, you should be grateful and not talk too much about it. But I think there are things that happen around us that even as a scientist, even if you are a scientist and you are very rational, there are still things that I at least accept as being irrational or unexplainable.
Professor, you have compared yourself with a professional dancer due to discipline and the pressure with which you must work with. I would like to compare you additionally with a professional hiker or a trapeze walking on the tightrope. I visualize you being completely focused, each movement being vital to the next one, each mistake lethal. It's a fine line what you and your team walk every day. In every operation, no matter how predictable it seems, it takes a lot of courage. And thank you for being courageous enough to give hope to people, to kids and their parents that others would rather classify as hopeless cases. And thank you very much for sharing your time and granting us a superb interview.
I thank you because I think that you very well prepared the questions. You took the time to really go into the book, and I appreciate that very much. I appreciate that I could be here with you, and I wish you all the best for the future podcasts. And I'm grateful that I was on your list of nominees. Thank you very much.
Thank you to our listeners wherever you are for having allowed us to share time with you. Shall you be interested in learning about Professor Vajkoczy's projects or would like to contact him, please take a look at this episode's description. We will see you next time. Bye-bye.